as I said, I'm retired CIA, and I live on Capitol Hill. So, and for those of you who happen to know Larry, he'd be quite persuasive. So I'm very much involved in a Loudoun story, but it was also a story that really fit, in a way, my own history, but only the other side. I grew up in the South, South Carolina, Georgia, attended segregated schools from the time, the entire period of my early education, from a rural, very rural, one mule farm, tobacco farm in South Carolina, and eventually small town South Carolina, and then the suburbs of Atlanta. But we know the story of segregation, this civil rights movement, how it affected our communities, the violence and hatred involved in integration. And I, as basically a student of Southern history and Black history, have followed it and I know quite a bit. But I realized what I don't know is the history of those local schools that were in my community, whether it's when I was 10 years old on a tobacco farm or even in Atlanta, Georgia. Their story, how the kids dealt with the segregation, how the parents had to fight this. And so to me, this is a story that's not just Loudoun's, it's one that can apply to many communities in the South, and especially those that were rural. A little factoid, the first high school, Douglas accredited school, 1940. In DC, the first Black accredited high school, 1870, the same time as the beginning of the school system. So the rural areas really face the most resistance against integration, because you'll find high schools, Black high schools in Virginia, but always in a more urban area, or Petersburg, which claims to be the first, and Richmond. And the same applies to South Carolina in terms of how they did their schools. But with that, I became really like Larry, who has a passion, and this is a commitment. This book's really a cause. It's more than just the local history of Loudoun. It's a broader history that applies throughout the country, and we're dealing with issues today.
I couldn't avoid saying this. Thank you for dropping in, given the history of this building. For those you don't know, the bottom floor was the Dewdrop Inn, where Blacks had music and dancing. The upper floor was the IOF, the International Organization of Oddfellows. But I couldn't avoid mentioning that, the Dewdrop Inn. There's a lot of establishments, Black establishments here in Leesburg, like the Robinson's Barbershop. And what I discovered through my research, as I'm pointing out right here, is that they were not just social places. Mr. Houston here from Howard University sought the advice of the barber on the gentleman who was being tried for murder. It's a very famous murder case, by the way. There's a good book about it at the Balch Library. If you've not read it, you should do that. I'd like to take a minute to talk about my own story on segregation, because someone, a fourth grader, once asked me, "Well, Mr. Roeder, this is an interesting story you're telling us, but by the way, you're white. Why is a white guy leading a Black history group?" And that's a very good question. There are a lot of reasons for it. This is one of them. This is my girlfriend back in college, Maria Yofi, from Zaire. But it was called Zaire at one time, now the DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo. And as you can tell, she's not white. So I was in college, she was in college. We were dating rather seriously, and we went up near the Iowa border. My college was in northeast Missouri, and we refused service more than once because of the color of her skin. And of course, I knew what it was about, but I grew up abroad. Both of us did. I grew up in the Middle East and Europe, Cuba. She grew up in Africa and Europe, mainly in Sweden. So we both, at an intellectual level, understood what was happening. We see the newspapers and so forth, but it never happened to us. And of course, she was very upset. So we went to the college, which is Culver-Stockton. It's the oldest coeducational college west of the Mississippi. Very small, used to be called Christian University. And I said, we need to know more about the black experience. Because I'm embarrassed as an American that I don't know more. Martin Luther King had just been assassinated when I was living in Germany. I'm aware of some of the tensions, but I didn't see any of it. And so they formed a Black History Club, much like the one at the Box Library. In this case, though, to educate us and others about what blacks were going through. So we were introduced to the music of Storyville. I had a real education in black jazz and the music of Storyville versus Chicago versus New York. I love jazz, but I had not really thought of it in those terms before. And so it was quite cool. That's where I began to think about it. And then when I was running for office, wanted to be a supervisor. I lost, but I made these great friends at the Prosperity Baptist Church in Conklin, which is right next to South Riding on Braddock Road. This is formed by a black evangelist, the very first female priest, black female priest in Loudoun County. She wasn't ordained or anything like that, but she was an evangelist, much like the apostles, I guess you would say. And so Jenny Dean, her name was, and there are parks named after her, and there's a school named after her in Manassas, which at one point was the only way blacks could get a real high school education. She was one of the people who founded that church. And so there's this grounding in education. I said, you've written books. I said, yes, I've written a number of books. And I said, would you write our history? And I said, well, I don't know a lot about black history. I'm a student of black history, but I'm not an expert of black history. So that's okay. We have records. They pulled out of the cellar these records of the Conklin Colored School, which is right down the road. That's burned down in the 1950s, but they had these records, deeds and things like that. And so I went to the school system, who had recently discovered records in the training center on Union Street, the two-story structure built in 1883, which until 1920 was entirely a grammar school. Then in 1920, the first black high school was formed on the second floor. That's not Douglas, it is a training center. Formed by a guy named John C. Walker. Anyway, they had all these records. And they had been kept in this building which had no air conditioning, no heat, terrible conditions. Mary and I both had our master's degrees in library science at Catholic University and know something about the preservation of records. And I know quite a bit about it. So we developed a program, the team of volunteers I'm referring to, two of which you have here, of how to preserve these records. So the book that you're reading is about, yes, the impact on segregation on black education. But it's also a story about a determination to preserve that history in its physical form. Dave over here mentioned petitions, which we'll speak about more later on. I was going through all these records that they discovered, and one day in the box I found this red paper. You all been to an old butcher shop many years ago, red paper, that's where you have an old hot dog or steak. But it wasn't a desiccated steak I discovered. It was a stack of handwritten petitions by black and white parents looking for improvements to their schools. Crackly. You could, it was dusty. So it took a week or so for it to flatten out. And what I discovered there was real civil rights history. And we're going to talk more about that, but I'm saying, why do I do this? As an American growing up abroad, America was not a geography. The way I grew up, America was an idea. It was an experiment. And so it's not whether you live in Washington, D.C. or Virginia or Texas or Alaska, it's do you believe in that idea? And what I discovered here in Loudoun County was a group of people, the black community and the Quakers and others, who deeply believed in that and did everything they could to achieve full citizenship, and in the case of this study, proper education. And this I wasn't surprised, but at the same time, the detail that was coming out of these thousands and thousands of records was amazing. It's an American story. The Washington Post did a story on us on the research back in 2020, front page, which is great, right? Washington Post. Shortly thereafter, Georgetown University called me up, and I said, "Could we interview you about this study?" And I said, "Sure." They did interview other people in the county, And so we would like to have a book on summarizing your research, which was 10 years of research, I might add. Usually you beg publishers to come to you to do the book. You just beg, right? Or you self-publish or whatever. Here, a major publishing house was coming to me and said, we want you to write the book. So, and they wanted one voice. I had a whole team, you see 2 of them here, 3 of them here, who could have written different chapters. They said, so I am the principal author, but I want to emphasize this is a team effort. Nathan Bailey's words are in that book. Dave Previous' words are in that book. Barry's words are in that book. So they're all really co-authors. We had students involved in it. And it's a community effort. And it's meant to really speak as honestly as we could to not only the history of blacks and what they went through, but tell it honestly and with passion, I might add. It's not it's an academic work, but it's not written as a textbook. I've written textbooks before. It puts you to sleep. I said to Georgetown, I want a book that anybody can read at a price anybody can afford. So that's what this is. Let me see if I can figure out how to use this machine here. Okay. Well, as I mentioned, it's a 10-year study, a little over that actually. I want to point to this photograph right here, Ethel Ray Stewart Smith, 92 in 2020. She's the one that gave us the term dirt don't burn. So I'll talk a minute about. And if you go into the book on page 227, you'll find her right there. So this lady, when she was very young, was a teacher out at Willisville, it's out of part of the county. In 1950s, this 2-room schoolhouse, freezing, no wood, no coal. They kept pleading with the government to give them wood and coal to put in that one stove. 2-room schoolhouse, 1 stove, I might add. And they just didn't do it. She finally had to point out to Mr. Emmerich, who was the superintendent from 1917 to 1957, that dirt doesn't burn. It was a long sentence that she wrote. We talked to her and said, we want to do a countywide conference on this whole concept here of segregation and its impact on blacks and about how resources were less for blacks than for whites. We want to do it passionately but honestly, and she suggested that we condense that phrase to 3 words, and these are the 3 words that came up with, dirt don't burn. Georgetown fell in love with that title and said, that's the title for the book. We had thought chalkboard bravery, things like that. They said, dirt don't burn gets it. I would like to point out here on the right, the statue, which is going to be erected in a few weeks in front of Douglas High School. I designed that statue. I will say I designed it. I'm patting myself on the back a little hard. I came up with a sketch for that statue, that is for sure. It's a sketch I presented to NAACP at a rally some years ago. The idea was that kids are going up a steep hill to achieve equality. Well, they were going to put up a statue of some famous guy who had never been in the building, and we said, how about your parents? That's your parents, your grandparents, who struggled over many, many hurdles that we talk about in these meetings for equality in education. So they provided different design features to the statue. Jeff Hall out in Lewisville created it. It's going to be installed next month. So I wanted to mention that, not so much because I came up with the original design, but because it's unusual for these kind of monuments. They do often are of famous people, inspirational people. In this case, it's the actual ancestors of the people who achieved equality. And then, of course, Edwin Washington himself. Edwin Washington was a young man, teenager, living here in Leesburg, just a few blocks away on a farm, working in the inn, which at that time, today rather, is the archives of the circuit court. He was a waiter. And he didn't have an education, but he wanted it. It's during Reconstruction. You could still smell the war. It just ended. Race relations were terrible. You read the newspapers at the time over at the Walsh Library, they're constantly insulting blacks for doing anything. This kid, he had a mother without a job, he had a brother who was a farm laborer, and a younger brother who was too young to go to work. He could have been fired for asking to go to school, right? He didn't have a right to a job. But he managed to convince them that he needed to have a job. He needed to read and write because he could be a better waiter. They're not going to get cheated when there's a change. They can read the menu and go and prosper. I learned about him from the Quakers. There were no records on him in Loudoun County official records. I learned about it from the Quakers in Swarthmore. I said, I'm looking for an individual whom we can name the project after that exemplifies the heroism that we are seeing time and again in the records. And it'd be nice if it's a youth. And they said, how about this guy, which the Quakers wrote about in their own literature at the time. And he wrote an essay himself about the importance of education. We're actually now, through other volunteers, trying to find out who his descendants are so we can bring them here to Loudoun County and say, this is your ancestor. The story you'll see in the book is about struggle. Here's an example of one struggle, but it's also an example of how the black community approached struggle in a very professional way and really understood the basics of the Constitution and democracy. So both schools, the Grant School in Middleburg and the St. Louis Colored School in St. Louis, the village of St. Louis, were both overcrowded. And a doctor, Dr. Ed Mead from the Caribbean, was living in Middleburg, and he said, this is so overcrowded that you're going to have disease spreading. And he's talking about flu. And they made similar arguments before that even in St. Louis with that school. That's pretty small for like 90 people. It was so overcrowded, the kids were in overflow structures. Well, Grant, the people, the blacks in Middleburg, wanted the school to be in Middleburg. The blacks in St. Louis wanted to be in St. Louis. And we know from records of Gertrude Alexander, who was the genes teacher at the time and the supervisor of black teachers, records I discovered in Atlanta University that are not here, unpublished records, that the white government really wanted black schools to be on side roads, out of the way, not on the main drag. One of the ideas was to put the black school here in Maxville, which is right along Route 50. There's right now a recreational park right there. Try to imagine a large school there for blacks within sight of Route 50. You can see why the whites, who had the attitudes they had, would not like that. So back and forth, and we ended up here at Banneker. Good thing is, they built a good school. It's still a good school today. It's going to be restored. It's going to be fixed like they did at Douglas. Douglas just went through a multi-million-dollar restoration. I was part of that. They're going to do the same thing at Banneker. They're not going to tear it down. Some people were talking about that. And this is, of course, Nathan Bailey, who was standing in front of it, telling people in a video what it was like to go to that school. We hope to do that for every schoolhouse.
You see, that's a new Banneker, right? Is that the same? One of the schools that I saw then had a nice tile wall.
There's one Banneker.
Which one?
There's one Banneker.
Okay.
There's the St. Louis Colored School, and the kids migrated to here, to Banneker. There's just one. Now, in the background, in the grounds, there was at one time a house that was built after Banneker. All that's left is a chimney. But just the one. They did handwritten petitions. They met with the school board and so forth. The point is the blacks had learned during Reconstruction through the Quakers what the Constitution was all about and the Bill of Rights, that you had a right to petition for redress of grievances. Emmerich hated that. Written documents asking for your rights. The blacks insisted on using it. So did many whites, I want to say. This is a study looking at both groups. But blacks had to go over bigger hurdles because of the social, economic times that they were in, the segregation and prejudice. But they said, no, we're gonna do this. Let's just try to imagine, and we'll talk more about it, where people write up a petition, take it to church on Sunday, take it around to different farms, and then hand it to a white official saying, I want change. That's a whole different experience than some white farmer doing that. There are a lot of heroes, too many to name. You'll see a lot of them in the book. I'd just like to mention a handful of them. John C. Walker was a Sunday school teacher here in Leesburg. And in the 1920s, he's also a public school teacher. In the 1920s, he started the first high school program on the second floor of the training center. Very limited. For example, it's so limited that if he wanted to teach chemistry, the only way they could get beakers was not from the government, but from the kitchen of the black constituents. They had to do that extra. John C. Walker created a good program. As I say, it was limited, but it started with him. But here's a really interesting thing about him in the 1920s. What was going on? I think it was Dave, you were mentioning you wondered what's going on with the petition to sign. Well, this time, people are being lynched for taking on rights, being uppity blacks. He marched all the black teachers and students to the center of Leesburg, a southern capital, in the 1920s. Pretty brave act. I found out about it by looking at faint pencil markings in the school records that we're going through, and then correlated them to newspaper articles. That's how we discovered the march. It was written well in the newspaper. They didn't attack them. But the point is, it happened. That's the kind of bravery and determination we see constantly, and we try to document in the book, which is a summary. Edith Harris, who is on the cover of the book, right here, this wonderful picture of a lady in front of her log cabin with her dogs. Edith Harris came over in the 1930 actually, from Pennsylvania, university educated, and continued the high school program on the second floor of the training center until 1941 when it moved on to Douglas. It was accredited in 1940. My point being, the first accredited black high school is the training center, second floor. Doesn't take anything away from Douglas. Douglas is a monumental civil rights achievement. Blacks fought for it and got it through great pain. But I just wanted to say, we're talking about history. That's real history right there. They're this wretched building, which was closed eventually because it was dangerous to study there for fire, fear of fire. Gertrude Alexander, I just mentioned to her, Gertrude Alexander was the supervisor of black teachers. The first supervisor was hired in 1920. These were people they were white and black. They would supervise their own race. So this woman would supervise all the black teachers. She was associated with Hampton, was now Hampton University, and she also created a voting club to get blacks to register to vote. And she advocated for better education. She would teach blacks, as did Edith Harris, why are you where you are? What is your position and why is it that way? She's really getting to politically risky things. Again, what I used to call chalkboard bravery, because it was brave. Edwin Cicero Brown Sr., his grandson, is on our board of directors. This gentleman here was born on an Indian reservation, Oklahoma. As a kid, traveled by Conestoga wagon to Indiana, went to a integrated high school, picked cotton, and with his friends, bought a secondhand Model T and 4 or 5 secondhand tires, and they all drove across the United States to Washington, D.C., playing music to earn their keep. He went to Howard University, washed floors to get through Howard, and also Howard Law School. His first case was right here, getting toilets put in that building. It was built in 1883, outhouses. Pretty typical at that time, I'm not saying it's not, but by the 1950s, that's when this was taking place, they needed real flush toilets. He had to go to federal court to make that happen. His son became a civil rights attorney, and his grandson, who was on our board, is also a civil rights attorney. So it's quite a legacy. We're very proud to be associated with that. I'd like to mention Donna Croy. Donna Croy was the head of records at LCPS when I got involved. I kept asking questions about the Conklin Color School. Remember, I said, I want to know who went there, who taught there, was there a white school nearby, what were school conditions at the time. Those answers came from Donna there, who's see her nose buried in one of the old books. Donna Croy is really a hero, because these records that I'm talking about were going to be destroyed. Richmond thought, they're just old records, get rid of them. And she said, no, this is American history. This is civil rights history. And so she fought to keep them, and now we're administrating them, our team. So it's a real hero. I want to point that out. There's many heroes in the story. Oscar Emmerich, this is an early photograph of him. Oscar Emmerich was an educator in Loudoun County, born here, Percival. Went to the Philippines during the unpleasantness over there, and was going to be a teacher. They trained him to be a surveyor, which he used when he came back to Loudoun County, surveyed many of the school buildings, and became superintendent from 1917 to 1957. Now, he was a segregationist. He believed in the Plessy versus Ferguson concept of equality, separate but equal. We all know the Brown versus Board of Education understood that there's no such thing as separate and equal. You had to bring them together. But he did recognize something. This is before Brown. In a memo to the school board and the board of supervisors, we found this memo that he wrote saying, what? Very clearly, there's been discrimination here. And he said, because of that, if we don't change our ways, the courts are going to take control of the school from us. So he got it. Now, his vision of equality is certainly different than, say, probably ours. But the point is that even he got it. And I believe, personally, that if he had tried to go for full equality, he would have been fired. Because that was the politics at the time. So he's the one who allowed, after all, John C. Walker to do a high school program on the second floor. He's the one that hired Gertrude Alexander and so forth. So he wasn't opposed to black education at all. He made advances for them, helped them out. But he was a segregationist. That's a black mark, but it's important to be balanced here. When you're doing history, you need to treat each person, not with your own personal prejudice, and then not with presentism, but really understand the context of the time. So I wouldn't call him a hero exactly, but he was very important for the development of education. He was a progressive in techniques of education, and he did a lot for blacks in a limited way. But he did it in part because of this. From enslavement to 1968 and today, blacks were demanding excellence in education. Our book doesn't start in 1870 with the public school system. It begins with the age of enslavement and the deprivations that are put on blacks and the recognition that they demanded an education to read and write. And even though it was illegal in many cases for them to be trained that, slave owners did it because an educated manual labor is more useful to them. At least they can read and write and add and subtract. One of the interesting things I discovered in the records was this thing here, upper branch training. Upper branch is an old-fashioned term for what? Secondary school education, high school education, we would say today. And they constantly demanded this. That's what eventually led to the training program in 1920. But here's the interesting thing, and Nathan will talk about this. Maybe he can talk about it now. Until 1937, no public busing for blacks. Whites had transportation going back to, I think, 1910 in Lincoln. No buses for blacks until 1937. So how are they supposed to get to the limited high school program there was in Leesburg? They complained about this. Gertrude Alexander and Mr. Houston from Howard University got together, interviewed blacks in Loudoun County and said, what do you most want? And they said, we want this. We want buses so we can get to the training center to get that high school education so my kid can go to college eventually. I can't afford to take my kid to Washington, D.C. Some did, very few. I can't afford to take them to Manassas. That was Jenny Dean's program. Give us a public bus like you give me whites. And there was no thought to doing that. So, do you want to say something more about transportation before we go on, Nathan?
It's a good place.
Why don't you just take a minute to talk about it, and then we'll get in the Q's and A's. They'll probably have more questions.
So, as Larry will continue to expound the path from segregation and integration, starting in the 1870s with the public school system, and then by 1968, integration was under the full-fledged Loudoun County Well, transportation mirrors that evolution as well. It's stated in 1937 before blacks received their first LCPS bus. Now, that does not mean that blacks in Loudoun County sat down and said, well, till we get a bus, I guess we're screwed. No, they did not. And this is from a publication from the Douglas High School 50th anniversary, 1941 to 1990 publication, and it states, Mr. Will Brown personally provided transportation to the students in his area and also Hamilton. Mr. Townie Farrell, Sr., and Mr. Arthur Jackson of Waterford, Mr. C.P. Cook, Sr. of Middleburg, and Mr. Rob Anders of Lux in their areas. In the latter years, Mr. Brown purchased a station wagon. Students of Waterford were picked up in Paonia Springs. If they arrived, they only showed they were board the train under WNOD for the ride to Leesburg School. Okay? Louis Farrell of Waterford was always anxious to go to school and would hitchhike if her ride did not come. So they stepped up to the challenge. They didn't wait, but they kept pressing with petitions. Okay, and first one, Mr. Brown was noted as the first LCPS paid black driver in Loudoun County, 1937. Okay. But before then, he was doing others.
You know, I mentioned that petitions a minute ago. From the days of the Quakers, blacks understood that under the Constitution, they could write a letter to a government official and say, I want a change in my way of life. But this wasn't working. So what do? They hired lawyers. For example, Charles Hamilton Houston, one of the leaders of the NAACP, came here as a private attorney, hired for $1, not as a representative of the NAACP. He would not do that until there was a local chapter created. That was the deal. You want me as part of the NAACP, you create a chapter. But I will help you, and he did. And he found this whole concept here of the cost and they're not willing to do it was unconstitutional, a violation of the 14th Amendment. And that's key, because the whole argument for equality was changing to the 14th Amendment, equal justice under the law. And he was the national leader in that area, and that is what really changed things, I believe. The courthouse in Leesburg is already, I guess, named after him now, or was about to be. So petitions again. Here's Mr. Stewart, one of the bus drivers at Carver. And this is James Raby, another black attorney who was representing the blacks in this case on transportation. The point is that on this slide here is that blacks were writing to preserve their rights. Now, whites were doing the same thing, but blacks had bigger hurdles because of the politics of the time. And these were the main issues they're interested in, such as better teachers. They didn't want any old teacher. They want a better teacher because they want better quality education. They want their kids to advance. Someone asked me the other day, well, why do they care? Well, the reason they care is that if you get a better job, you get more money. You get more money, you can take care of your family, you can do more things like anybody else would want. I was actually kind of floored by the question, but anyway. But also repairs. Some of these petitions that Dave is studying here were about repairing a building. Now, here's the thing. The school system should have been repairing the building itself, right? They should cover the costs. But this one petition I recall, I think it was up in Willard, you can correct me on that, was leaning over. So the black community realized they're not going to get all the money they want. So they offered to provide free labor and so forth if they just get some help from the white government. Now, I don't recall anything like that happening in any white school. So I just want to point that out. That dirt don't burn means something. There was a different level of support, economic support for blacks. And we're going through all the records, the accounting and so forth. And that's just one example. We talk about transportation. This is something I very much wanted in an accredited high school. The training center was a high school, but it wasn't accredited, not till 1940. And Douglas is truly an achievement for that reason. The thing about Douglas is that the white government said to them, we don't have land for a black high school. So what did the blacks do? They set up bake sales, and they raised the money, $4,000, to buy the land plus a loan. And they said and they bought the land, and they said to the white government, we got land now, build us a high school. And said, well, we don't own that. We can't build you a high school there. We don't own it. You're going to have to sell it to us. Guess how much? $1. I mean, think about that. $1, and these people were poor, right? And what they had to go through to raise the $4,000 plus take on a loan. So after the building was built, guess what didn't happen? The white government did not buy furniture. Oh no, that's going to be up to the black community to buy the furniture. It's a different time. The hurdles were significant. Didn't have that problem in Lincoln. Didn't have that problem in other high schools and so forth. Certainly, the white population provided extra resources. Lincoln is famous, as a matter of fact, for being maybe at its time the finest high school in Northern Virginia because the Quaker community put extra money into hiring the best teachers, the best equipment, and all that. So I don't want to take away from that. I'm just saying that this should not have happened. And that's real history. But they got the building. And we recently restored it. Several $1 million. I hope you, if you've not visited the restored Douglas High School building, come on December the 2nd, because we'll be talking again to a much larger community. We'll have jazz music there, food, all free. It's at 2 o'clock. I want to make sure I get the right time. 2 o'clock on the 2nd of December at Douglas High School.
I think
Please come. Well, I was messing up the time. I thought this started at 6. It started at 6:30. So my poor friend over here, Eddie, over here, a lot earlier. Anyway, I've talked about lawyers, but I just want to reemphasize this gentleman right here. Really understood the violation of the Constitution with regard to blacks, but so did other lawyers such as James Raby, Edwin Cicero Brown. The blacks brought in a lot of lawyers, I should say, to represent them because they had to do it. And we're talking about Douglas, but I just wanted to point out this gentleman right here, Mr. John Wanzer. When I first came to Loudoun County and was thinking about black history, I should say, I was told about the Countywide League. You all heard about that, Countywide League? Anybody here not heard about that? When I was told about the Countywide League, it was like this unique thing in Loudoun County where all the black PTAs got together and it was a political force. I said, what is the Countywide League of black PTAs? And what I discovered was it was not unique to Loudoun County. It was something down elsewhere in Virginia as well, started by Hampton University. There is still, by the way, a black, such a Countywide League. It's in Botetourt County, excuse me, I'm mispronouncing it, in Kinsale. Anyway, this gentleman was the president of the Countywide League here in Loudoun County. And what was important was, again, this idea of sophisticated approach to politics and law. If you have individual PTAs around the county asking for food, asking for repairs, asking for better teachers and so forth, they don't have a lot of power with the school board, which is all white. But if they're all together, it's like a union. You now have the force of many arguing for improvements. So they got that. And this really got my attention. I grew up in really terrible countries. They're wonderful countries, but the civil rights were pretty bad. And every time people would raise their hand and try to have better civil rights, they get knocked down. Here in Loudoun County, blacks knew it was risky. People were being lynched in different parts of the South. But they used all these techniques right out of the Bill of Rights, right out of the Constitution, to get their rights. And they were determined to do it, didn't let up. John Wanzer is a great hero. He was a blacksmith in Middleburg. I had this picture of him, which I believe is in the book, where he's got his hammer banging away on iron. I think what he's doing is banging his way on segregation, trying to bend it. That's how I took the photograph. Now, I'd like to talk about this for a second. 1956, school board and the board of supervisors, they're getting worried about the black community. They keep pushing for better schools, better teachers. We're going to offer them a deal. We're going to use the same tired arguments that there's not enough money. But we're going to improve your buildings if you do something. And that is if you agree to segregation. Black community said, hell no. We're not doing that. We want integration. At no time did the black community ever bend to the injustice of segregation. At no time, from 1870 to 1968, did they do that. They repeatedly push for improvements. And that's why that statue I thought was so important. Because that statue I was talking about at the beginning, those are those people. The ancestors of the folks that are here today who fought for those. So we found a memo on this in the records, and this is a newspaper article about it, but the document itself had never been photographed, brought to the public. It's in the book. And that's one thing we try to do, is bring things out to the public that have never been published, so people really understand the true history. And I want to thank, in that regard, Loudoun County Public Schools for working with this. We could not have done this without the partnership of the Loudoun County Public Schools and the Loudoun County School Board. The school board has been a real backer of our research. Jeff Morris, for example, on the school board, repeatedly would talk about the value of black history and the value of what we're doing. And I want to mention that because we are nonpartisan. I never ask any of my volunteers what their political party is, none of my business. All I care about as the head of this thing is that we tell it straight and that we do peer review. The peer review is the people here in Loudoun County. Did I get it right? Did we get it right? It's a we thing, by the way, not just I. Did we get it right? And when we did the book, we also did a peer review. Professors who are experts in black history reviewed that book repeatedly and said, could you change this? Can you change that? And that made it a stronger book. You know, a lot of books are self-published and there's not a lot of peer review. This is done by University Press, and we insisted on that kind of review. So I'm hoping you don't find any errors in it, but I'm just saying that was the idea. So these are some of our team right here. And this is Louis Jett, who is a big supporter of our team as well. Some of you may know Louis from Carver, where he's a big supporter of their history. And with that, I just want to thank you for being here, for dropping in. We need more volunteers. We've written this book. We plan to write more. And we need people to help us with research on a school in Lincoln, or just on a topic like transportation or health. Health is a big part of the story. You know, the Tuskegee experiment you've all heard about maybe impacted people right here in Loudoun County, impacted people in St. Louis. I mean, it's a terrible thing, right? There's also hookworm throughout the county, affected whites and blacks. I have this picture, so it's in the book. Here's this bunch of kids standing in line near a fence line on ground, and they're about to get awards for reading. And this one kid has got barefoot in the dirt. Perfect candidate for hookworm. It was a major problem here. What we would like to do is attract a doctor or nurse, some kind of medical expert, to look at the records that we've got. Not reveal that Johnny had a heart attack or whatever. That's personal information. But what really happened, and we talk about it, but I'm not a doctor. I just play one in front of you. I want a real doctor or nurse to look at it, and other experts like that. With that, I'm going to close. Talked enough. If you've not bought a book, I hope you will. Half that money goes towards the society, 100% for research. Some of it goes to the Black History Committee as well, because we are partners with them. Yes, sir.